Patrick Cordero me escucha siempre con atención. Me da la fuerza y la calma, me ofrece la solución. Él defiende mi vida, protege mi hogar. Con su equipo de expertos me vuelve a levantar. En el sur de la Florida, su nombre es la verdad. Un abogado de confianza que sabe cómo actuar.
Hey everyone, my name is Steven Cordero. I'm an attorney here in the law offices of Patrick Cordero. And I usually do this show in Spanish, so my mind works in Spanish. I might slip into Spanish. Most of our clients do speak Spanish. But just given this new format and everything, we're going to try out doing a show in English, which is something that I'm personally not used to, even though I speak English as a first language. That's actually not true. I speak Spanish as a first language, and I picked up English at some point along the way, but it is my dominant, what I would say, my first language. Okay? So pardon my Cubanisms, and if I slip into Spanish, it's just the way that I think, and it's the way that I'm used to explaining this type of information to people. I've done a series of shows in the past here as we move into this new space, and I've been talking mostly on mortgages. Why? It's probably the most significant investment for a lot of people. I think in most cases it is the single largest expense that most people have. It's very important in all aspects of a bankruptcy. Be it a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13. It's a big part of the state, the way the state of Florida does its exemptions. And they tend to garner a lot of interest, and the cases themselves that we see that have mortgages or issues with mortgages tend to be some of the more delicate and time-consuming, is why it's literally the roof over your head. I also think that regardless of where you are in the spectrum, we see cases who come in because the issue is literally with a credit card company that's suing them. But most of our cases, I'd say, do have a combination. They have a credit card, or they have several credit cards. They have a vehicle, whether it's a lease or a finance agreement, 3-year lease, 5-year finance, or and some sort of mortgage, right? Either on one property or two properties. These are now in the weeds, but in most cases, our clients are up to date with their mortgages. I think the issue, but either way you look at it, to the extent that it's the biggest expense that you have, some people just flat out, can't keep up with their mortgages either because their income is fixed, or they were working at the time they signed up for it, and now situations changed, unforeseen health issues, whatever that is. But I want to say that, or I'd like to believe that in most cases that expense accounts for most of the issues that we do see, even with what we call cure and maintain cases that are specifically curing and maintaining an arrearage with, or is trying to stop a foreclosure with respect to a property where they live, or a second property, vacation home, etc. In the sense that cost has gone up, so now they've fallen behind on their credit cards because they're trying to keep up with the payments for that house, right? They did it in that order. But we see both, right? And what I've heard from staff here over the past few weeks, and I've seen it myself, is a bit of an increase from what we've been seeing the past few years in terms of cases that are specifically curing and maintaining a first mortgage on a property, right, in Florida. So I want to say the difference is something between, we file a lot of cases, something between one case every 2 weeks that's securing a mortgage. Maybe that case is a repeat filer, income has changed or something like that, and now we're filing a second case back to back to reset the clock, which is quite common. I think most people actually who are, depending on the balances that they have, the 5-year limit that's given to trying to cure these things through a Chapter 13 bankruptcies, it can be fairly aggressive depending on the balances that we're talking about. If you're behind $100,000 on a mortgage, you literally take that $100,000, you divide it by 60, and then you add that to the regular payment that you have every month with the mortgage, which could go up and could go down, and it often does. And it has, and this is actually what necessitates a lot of the repeat filings that we see here, in the sense that over the last 2 years, notwithstanding any changes in your personal financial situation, just the values of properties in Miami-Dade County have gone up so much that it's affected the escrow accounts and the escrow payments on both of these, on these types of accounts, right? So the percentage of your payment, if you have a regular mortgage, it includes everything. It includes the fixed payment includes the regular payment, includes the fixed portion and also the principal and interest, right? So then on top of that, they'll add a separate escrow payment for taxes and insurance. And this is where the issue, I think, has come up in the last few years. As the properties get more expensive, the taxes due on that property have gone up. And so the escrow payments, or the escrow cushion that you have with your mortgage company, is not enough to cover that amount. And so there's a deficit there that they then pass on to you as either an arrearage or it's something that has to be cured, or you just can't keep up, or you're paying the same amount even though the payment has escalated away from what you're paying. And when you miss one payment, now the mortgage company is going to apply it however they want to based on the contract that you signed with them. So, assuming it starts accruing interest or late fees and you make that same payment, they're going to apply it first to those fees, and then whatever's left over, they're going to apply it to the regular payment that you had due. So unless you cover both, it's very normal that you'll fall behind even more, and this is where the problem starts, right? And what we get in bankruptcy once a case is filed is an actual spreadsheet that shows that entire history. And you can see, most of the cases we see now, the mortgages were sent around 2015, 2016, but to go back to the point that triggered this, I'm trying to bring in exhibits for the first time. I heard from staff upstairs who are on the front lines that we're seeing more cases like this. There's the difference between saying one case every 2 weeks, and it may be a repeat filer, versus 2 to 3 cases in a week. That's a pretty significant increase from our perspective, and especially if the cases, I didn't ask her at the time, but assuming that the cases are new cases, that set me on a little bit of a spiral. So I went looking for data to support this, and I found these charts on the National Mortgage Database. Apparently after the pandemic, and even before then, after the crisis in 2008, the government got very good at counting and gathering data on mortgage statistics, right? So these are really good indicators of where the economy is going overall, but for my purposes, it just gives me a preview of what's happening, or some sort of scientific basis to back up what this person told me in the office, that she's seeing more of these cases. The data bears that out. So what they do, you'll notice that these databases track these statistics by county, by state, by quarter, and then they do it with respect to delinquencies, so 30 to 60 days, more or less the way the credit reporting bureaus do this, 90 to 180 days, and then just in general flat out foreclosures, which I didn't include in this data set, but I'll maybe circle back to that. I thought the 30 to 60 day delinquencies were more interesting because these are not necessarily foreclosure actions, maybe there's no problem, but these are just literally, each one of these little ticks is a person who was 30 to 60 days behind on a mortgage payment. Maybe they cured it afterwards and the issue went away, but either way, there was a month there or there was some time there where it got a little dicey. And what we've seen is that basically since a peak of around 7% during the crisis in 2008, and there's been a downward trend. It dropped precipitously during the first years of the Trump administration, right around the time that we were all celebrating, the economy's roaring, And of course, the pandemic hit, and this is one that I've kind of isolated here because from that dramatic dip around 2017, it peaked at around 2.4% in the fourth quarter of 2019. And then from there, the number dropped again. Why? Around the time of the pandemic, the Congress, if you recall, they rolled out all these emergency packages, and one of them was a provision that basically made it illegal for a company to report any of these types of delinquencies to a reporting agency, to a credit bureau. The idea, I think, was to sort of soften the blow of the pandemic. It was part of that emergency package that they rolled out. Some of those changes were changes to the bankruptcy laws themselves, which affected our work here in the form of extensions on the 5-year limits and things like that. But what you've seen since the pandemic is a gradual return, or just an upward trend, which is very much against what we've been seeing since 2008 to the pandemic itself. It's almost like a different phase. So you have that sharp spike of the pandemic, you have a gradual dip, followed by a sharp decrease in 2017, then a sharp increase around the time of the pandemic. And then right when the pandemic happened, either because we stopped counting or because the mortgage companies themselves were, working with their clients to try and avoid a bigger disaster, another spike, they rolled out forbearance agreements, which we started counting around that time. And that's in another chart where you'll see this gray that's introduced on these bar charts, right? The light orange being foreclosures, which also decrease, all of them decreasing, but then 90 to 180 days in the sort of red rust color, and then blue 30 to 60 days past due, but then there's this new category, right? These grays, these sharp spikes. These are all the forbearance agreements, all of the emergency, I guess they lump them all together, but they don't exist before, mostly because we didn't start counting, but arguably there was no need for them. I'd be curious to see where these accounts have ended up, just because of the nature of the forbearance agreements themselves. The typical one would usually just front load, or not front load, sort of back end whatever balances you had, for a period of 1 to 2 years, saying, listen, I'm not going to hassle you for a late payment from now until 2024, but in 2026, I'm going to ask you for all of that balance due as a balloon or retroactive. So I'm interesting choice, but what worries me more or less is just that, until I saw this, I didn't think of it this way, but it's just the gradual upward trend. More and more people gradually are 30 to 60 days past due on a mortgage. Like I said, maybe they're fixing it. It's going up and down, but overall the trend is that it's increasing gradually to the point where now, and there's another chart that shows this, in terms of now switching to 90 to 180 days past due, we're at 1%, which is the highest. It's well, not the highest, but it's 1%. The last time we were at 1% was before the pandemic. So it's basically returned. I don't know if this means that we're back to pre-pandemic levels, or if it's a new phase, but it's definitely a new, sort of gradual increase. And just based on what I've seen with people who were already in bankruptcy at the time that this all began, let's say 2018, 2019, we have cases that are that old, believe it or not, just because the CARES Act also included a provision to extend the amount of time that you could be in bankruptcy if you were already in one. So if you were in a 5-year plan, you could extend, no questions asked for the most part, or at the discretion of the trustees up to 2 more years. So we're just now seeing these cases sort of rolling off of our list of active cases from 2018, 2019. They stand out because they have that prefix, 19, 20. 20 not so much, because we're right now at the end of the natural expiration of a natural 5-year plan. But it's possible that some 2020 and 2021 cases were able to get filed and then immediately apply for that extension, so they won't be done until 2027. With cases that have to deal with this issue, with mortgages in particular, that can be fairly aggressive. And like I said, we do see a lot of repeat filers with respect to mortgages just because they need more time in good faith to try and pay off the 6-figure deficit that they had, whether it was because of the pandemic or even before. But no, just some interesting statistics. And this was just something that I found, I want to say a few days ago, and I decided to make a show out of it just because I said the shows that we do that deal with mortgages, I think it's what interests most people. I said for most people who have a mortgage, it's the most significant expense. Most of our clients, at least in Chapter 13s, do have a mortgage, even if they are up to date with it. And if you ask me again, chicken egg, that expense might be what's putting pressure on the unsecured debt that they had. And they've changed in really unexpected ways simply because of the inflation and the increases in property values, which as of today, I'm reading articles now saying people are delisting properties en masse. And what we're looking at, and I think what we're seeing is basically a slowly, which is the goal, right? This is what the Fed is trying to do, a very slow, gradual slip into something of a recession in order to offset the inflationary period of the last 2 to 3 years. And they're doing that by holding interest rates very, very high. So I'm going to try and update this every quarter as much as I can to keep abreast of it, but it definitely looks like we're in a new sort of phase. I don't want to say the sky is falling, but and the data bears it out. It's been a gradual increase month on month, ups and downs, but overall the trend is a gradual increase. So I'd be curious to see how this goes, if it peaks here and begins to fall, or if it continues to go up. If it begins to go up above, I'd say maybe even just the way it was around the time of the pandemic, I'd be concerned. But again, I think that's what would be expected to the extent that we're predicting some sort of recessionary period. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. As I find more of these things, I'll bring them. I'm discovering this resource. The government actually is very, very helpful in counting these things. And the dashboard itself is quite fantastic. You can look it up by types of mortgage, by delinquencies, whether it's a conventional mortgage or a government loan like a VA or an FHA loan, and then 30 to 60 days, 90 to 180 days. Very interesting stuff there, but that's from the National Mortgage Database. Thank you.
Seguimos con más consultas con Patrick Cordero.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Steven Cordero. I'm an attorney here in the law offices of Patrick Cordero. We focus primarily on individual and consumer bankruptcies, financial issues, mortgages, restructuring, things like this. And I've been taking some time today to talk about specifically mortgages based on some charts and some data that I found. And what triggered this was actually, aside from the interest that these videos have garnered, is a comment that I heard from staff upstairs who are on the front lines who were telling me that they're seeing more and more people filing bankruptcy with mortgages. This sent me, kind of into ChatGPT and into sort of Consumer Protection Finance Bureau, looking up the things just to see what the data would bear out, if I could give any scientific heft to this. And that sort of tying it back in to the larger pictures is why do we care, right? What's the purpose of what we do here? Really fixing credit, and it's a question that I get most of the time, right? What's the purpose of credit, the score, the reason that we track it? What's the importance? It's usually so that you can get approved at a decent rate with something that you can afford for financing, to be able to get a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage like the one that we've been discussing, right? And what I was saying in the last segment was that essentially, most of our clients who come here are actually up to date with their mortgages, to the extent that they actually have one. And the issue, I think, is that payment, my theory, is that payment tends to put pressure on other debts, right, on credit cards. So, if it's tight, or if you have an unforeseen change in your financial situation, you'll correctly pay the mortgage first, and then gradually the issue starts coming with respect to credit cards and unsecured debts, right, which eventually can lead to collections or lawsuits or missed payments. And to that end, it all, even though we separate them here, it's 90% of what we do is classify, right? This is a secured debt, this is a priority debt, this is an unsecured debt. With respect to the way that the law reflects it, which is exactly that, and which is more or less natural, right? The mortgage comes first, secured debts come first, right? With respect to the bigger picture, which is, how do you fix the issues with your credit through a bankruptcy? Most people say, oh, well, it's going to destroy my credit. That's a very common misconception. It's one of the questions I get the most. I was with a young filer yesterday that we were discussing exactly this issue, and he said, what do you recommend? And I go, do you recommend, when can I get new credit cards? I go, to the extent that the issue that we're resolving in the bankruptcy is a credit history that has missed payments, and I found this interesting pie chart on ChatGPT that makes it very elegant, right? So it shows you the percentage weight that's given to each of these data points. Payment history is the heaviest. That's 35%. So if you miss a payment, that's the worst thing that you could do. 30, 60, 180, eventually into collections. I mean, if you go to your credit report, you'll see it, this little grid with boxes, at least that's how it looks on mine, little grid with boxes showing every month, and it'll be a green check mark or some sort of marker that shows whether you were 30, 60, whether it was on time, 30, 60, 90. It's the worst thing that you could do is miss a payment altogether. I'm not saying that you should skip a payment or make minimum payments. That's not necessarily any better, but to the extent that you make a minimum payment, you've at least made a payment, right? So your payment history will show that you paid on time. What's happening is that your utilization rate, which is the next biggest, starts to go up. Why? Because now you're paying interest on all that excess, payment that excess balance that you didn't pay off in full the month before. And utilization is tracked on a basis of 30%. It's weighted 30%, but it also accounts for about 30%. Not just of the score, but if your limit, if you have a credit card with a limit of $10,000, the rule of thumb is that you should keep it under 30%. So pretend that limit is actually 30% of what you would think it is, and which would put you around $3,000. Right? So you're not using the full 10. You get bonus points for keeping it under 30%. And so eventually, these things all get reset when you file a Chapter 13 bankruptcy. So to the extent that the issue with your credit that brought you to us was a spotty payment history, or a late payment or something like that. I think I was 30 days late when I was in college for like one time, and I still have a 99%. Like 7 years minimum, but it stays there for a long time because it's that important, right? It speaks to your ability to pay, your I guess financial responsibility. But all of this is in the service of what usually, right? Why do I want good credit? So that I can buy a house, which has become almost impossible. And it's become almost impossible for the reasons that you see. I found this other chart that actually shows us how interest rates on a 30-year fixed mortgage, fixed mortgage rate, has changed over the last, in this chart I showed over the last, I want to say, 10 years from 2015 to 2024. But you can see they were at around 4%. They picked up to around 4.5% around 2018. Then the pandemic came, and the Fed dropped rates precipitously to try and stabilize the economy. The government loaned out tremendous amounts of money in forms of emergency disaster relief funds, SBA loans to prop up small businesses. They did it all through this mechanism of PPP loans, which a lot of our clients took advantage of and which helped them stay afloat. But the result of that was that a tremendous amount of money was dumped into the economy over a very short period of time, which triggered the inflation that we've been hearing about over the last 2 to 3 years. And for that reason, you see this aggressive spike, even though we think of it as like a gradual, never-ending story. There's this spike up to around 7%, 6.6%, 6.5% between 2021 and 2023, which is now just gradually starting to come down. But this correlates directly to housing prices, to the cost of a mortgage, how much interest you're going to pay. I'm assuming that you can qualify based on your credit history, right? So this is the relevance of this, and this bears out in the information that we've been seeing. So as everything becomes more expensive and it becomes harder to borrow money, the house, as to the extent that you actually had a mortgage either before or around the same time, it might have gone up. The value of that property would have gone up not just because of inflation, but because of the market bubble that we have locally here in South Florida, which I covered in the last segment with respect to charts that's focused specifically on the area where we tend to work, which is South Florida, Middle District of Florida, Southern District of Florida. And what we started to see was, we've seen an increase, not a dramatic spike that would, signal a crisis, but up, right? Up from, let's say, 1 to 2 cases every 2 weeks that are, specifically curing an issue with the mortgage, to maybe 2 to 3 in a week, I think we had 2 or 3 last week. I'm not sure if those were repeat cases or brand new cases, but that's a point to clarify for the next one. But either way, it's up, right? It's more than what we would expect, and that bears out in the data that I found. Looking at 30 to 80, 90 days. So this is not foreclosures necessarily. These are not bankruptcy filings, but this is just a marker of how many people are late more than 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months behind on a mortgage payment, 30 to 60 to 90 days. So it's showing a gradual increase. More and more people are slipping behind. And I think part of that has to do not just with the market bubble that we're seeing, right? I was reading an article today that said essentially that people are delisting properties from the MLS and from Zillow en masse. Why? Because they're not selling. Why aren't they selling? Because nobody can qualify for a mortgage. Why? Because the interest rates are above 6, or were around the last 2 to 3 years above 6%. Inflation has made everything much more expensive, so you have less disposable income that you could conceivably use to pay. The dollar doesn't stretch as far, so you don't have the income to cover the cost of a sophisticated instrument like a 30-year mortgage. And the issue then becomes unexpected. So let's say you sign your mortgage in 2019 based on a payment of XYZ, $1,500 with a $300 escrow. If inflation makes the value of that property rise, then the part of that payment that pertains to your escrow and your taxes, this is just my theory now. There's no data that shows this, but my theory is that that's what's creating the issue, right? The rapid inflation and appreciation of properties in ways that we couldn't expect over a very short period of time have made it so that the escrow payments associated with these mortgages, because the fixed payment is not going to change. That's based on the interest rate you had when you signed, assuming it's a fixed rate mortgage. The issue is that the escrow on the payments has gone up in a way that you didn't think would ever happen when you signed that mortgage in 2018. Why? Because you didn't know that the entire economy was going to shut down and that everything was going to go the way that it did just a year or two later. And that's what based on that, I've started looking now out of curiosity just to see when the cases that we have now that are either in the process, whenever I come across one, they give me a very exhaustive payment history. And the payment history shows you month by month all the transactions on the account. So I'm going back and looking. Most of these cases, 2014, 2015, 2016, and then boom, 5 years in, all of this other stuff happens. So, there's that subset that applied for forbearances and all these one-time agreements, but the trend is kind of like it looks like it's doing this. Right? It looks like a U. It looks like it went down from the from the crisis in 2008, the mortgage crisis, down significantly. Then it sort of hit a bottom. It bottomed out around, let's say, January of 2022, 2023. Which could be for a number of reasons. It could be that we were literally not counting because of the changes we made to the laws around this time, where the government literally, through the CARES Act, said, we don't want you to report delinquencies for the next XYZ period of time to credit agencies. Why? The idea, I guess, being to give people a little bit of a break and not have their credit destroyed by an unforeseen act of God. But it could be that we were literally not counting, or just companies were not enforcing, or we had additional income in the form of government benefits and emergency disaster relief loans that allowed people to prop up their mortgages. But now that that's stopped, the inflation is kind of sticky, is the word that you keep bringing. It's sticky. It's not dropping, and the property is not dropping. And what the Fed is trying to do is actually draw this out, from what I understand. They're trying to draw it out very smoothly to not trigger another, dramatic spike in the terms of the 2008 crisis, where it spiked up to 6% in terms of delinquencies and then back down, and everybody went into foreclosure. Or the pandemic, where we had to literally change the laws to stop counting. But the trend is a troubling U. It kind of comes down right around 2022, and now it's picking back up to the point where now it's back about as high as it was in 2019, 2018, before we started, I don't want to say fudging the numbers, that's not correct, but it's sort of changing the laws to stop counting certain things, introducing emergency, before the disruption of the pandemic that changed the way that we calculate a lot of these things. It looks like it's back. But the other thing that you'll see in charts like this, like for instance the chart that tracks 30 to 80, 89-day delinquencies on a national basis, you see this abrupt kind of, it looks like a heartbeat, and then it stops, almost like a flat line, which again, everybody, we're not counting, or, we're just, we have a forbearance agreement that means that it's not being reported as a delinquency anymore because I accepted this agreement. And then the heartbeat starts up again, but it's, sort of, imagine if your heartbeat just keeps going up and up and up and up. And that's what we're seeing, in the charts now on a national basis. Right? So I don't want to say that, it spells doom, but the number is up. And it looks like it's sort of an overall increasing trend, right? Not in a shock way, but over I'd say the last 2 to 3 years. This bears out in what we're seeing day to day here, in the sense that, from one case every month to, 2 or 3 cases a week. that are specifically curing an issue with the mortgage. But as this gets updated every quarter, I'll try to bring more information and talk about this more. But again, it's a nice tie into the bigger issue, which is why do we do this? Why are we here? What is bankruptcy? Bankruptcy is here really as a last resort. It is a benefit, but it is the way that you restore your credit to the extent that you have an issue with a mortgage that would affect your credit or something with your payment history. This is how you do that, right? The bankruptcy resets all of that information. It literally resets the reporting on your payment history with respect to unsecured debts. It is a public action, so it is like a lawsuit or anything else. If you had a creditor that was suing you, it'll show there for about 7 years. But it is usually what we usually see in cases that are dealing with unsecured debts, whether it's a mortgage or something else. To the extent that the bankruptcy resets that, if the issue was a payment history, that part of your credit report, once it's no longer appearing, actually causes your score to go up quite quickly. Why? Because it's just literally the algorithm is not picking it up. But again, the bigger issue, why? Why do we care? My score, 750, 600, 500. It's usually for something like this, right? I want to build my credit up so that I can get a good rate on a mortgage, which is very difficult to do right now. But trying to tie it all in together in terms of what we see here, and it's a very common question.
Patrick Cordero me escucha siempre con atención.